broadcasting live from the barren and empty floor of the Ford F-150 plant in Detroit, Michigan, sometime in the next few years. It's Radio Free Stockholm, with an episode all about cars, people who drive them, and the Chinese people who aren't driving them. So we're going to talk about a lot of interesting stuff on this episode. We're going to start with vehicle sales and the automobile industry in general. And we're going to talk about some tech. We're going to talk about China. And we're going to talk about just sort of the shape of the economy and probably a bit more of my oil brain nonsense. And I'm going through a little bit of an existential crisis here, so I'm probably going to talk about mortality at some point. So let's take it away. I'm here. I'm Bang Bang Duck. And with me is...
Hi, I'm Alita. New take. Hi, I'm Ilita.
Hi, this is MDL.
Yeah, guys. So, we've been looking at, so China is what we've been looking at. We've been looking at declines in automobile purchases in China and why these are interesting. So China's one of the largest markets in the world. And so the idea over the past, I guess, decade or so has been that China will just sort of sop up any excess demand or excess supply. So if you need to sell something, you can just go to China and sell it because there's 1.5 billion people there. They're going to buy something. So what do you guys were talking about specifically issues with the with what those declines mean? You want to talk about that, Dick?
Yeah. It seems interesting in terms of just like I was listening to sort of like David Harvey talking about like rate and mass of surplus value and like growth recently, and there's this kind of like discussion in like how China largely like is shifting from like a labor intensive economy to a more capital intensive one. And you can kind of see that in the Africa like infrastructure projects they're doing, where there's more like exporting or like externally directed foreign investment, where they have surplus that they're starting to offload, and they're sort of like beginning to be able to like position themselves as a competitor on a global scale to like the US, which is a much more like capitally intensive national economy. And it seems like that has something to do with this sort of like relative decline in these like consumptive numbers to a degree.
That would point to a definite shift in the dynamics of the market in China. If Chinese firms are offloading capital into particularly Africa, but also Southeast Asia, that means largely the domestic market can't soak up all of the available production in China. They have to export it elsewhere. So that means definite trouble for any, say, American firms that are looking to offload their surplus to China.
Yeah, there's a graph here in the New York Times article that says that China's auto industry, for example, half of its capacity is unused.
Oh wow!
Yeah, there's a graph here. I'll put that in voice so you guys can see it. But it shows like the unused capacity in auto manufacturing for China, North America, Europe, and Japan. And so China not only has some of the highest auto production that's actually in use, but 26 million vehicles per year. I think that number is. But its unused capacity is 25 million vehicles per year. So that implies one of two things. It implies either that China's economy is there's something really funky looking under the hood, as it were, or there's some issues with or they have a lot of like space to grow, and I think, I mean, it looks like the former, because if China's economy had a lot of space to grow right now, it would be growing.
Yeah, it's really hard to figure out what's going on under the hood, because so many of these enterprises in China are effective public-private partnerships between the central people's government and domestic or foreign firms. So a lot of this excess capacity is obviously being subsidized by the state for one reason or the other.
That's probably keeping it like relatively stable at present, honestly.
Hmm. There's been some cuts recently to like automobile subsidies and cuts to new energy production subsidies, actually, over the past year or so, which is interesting. So either they feel like those sections of the economy are strong enough to stand up on their own, or
They're tightening the belt because they don't have the means to continue the level of protectionism and subsidy.
absolutely.
That would,
Go ahead.
I was saying like that would kind of like it's a kind of like interesting sort of like parallel situation to be developing with like how like the US auto sector is also moving right now. Like when we think about like like auto loans, tying these into this, there seems to have been like there's like a mass like growth of like auto loans, and it's kind of like just an open knowledge now that there's an auto loan bubble. I think it's like $1.3 trillion right now,
Uh-huh.
and a ton of that is totally like very much reliant on subprime lending, and like 21% of all new like auto loan originations are subprime loans, and a lot of these like they're not coming from banks, they're coming from like captive lenders, which are just like these apparatuses constructed by automotive manufacturers to push like specific auto like makes of cars. So each sort of like sector of the industry or each company has its own captive lender apparatus to push product. But like the bubble that's been created has created this situation where they've had to tighten loan like qualifications. So like less qualified loan applicants now are like increasingly being like loaned out used cars to mitigate that risk, and that's having a sort of like adverse effect on the ability to consume new product getting pushed out. And I think about like where you can kind of see this looming bubble that's getting like really heavily affected by the U.S. China trade war, in the UAW strike going on right now, where like the much of the demands have a lot to do with like job security, maintaining health benefits, stuff like that. You had a point, Ailita?
Yeah, and I recently had the misfortune of having to actually purchase a car and go through the entire system of how they try to push demand on people. And one thing that just really struck me is how much of the lot I was at. It was a local one. It was connected to several different manufacturers, Honda as well as Ford, which was weird that how they had sponsorship from both. And so much of it is the certified used vehicle. I hope you can hear the scare quotes. So much of, yeah, because automobiles are so tremendously expensive. Obviously, not everyone can afford a new vehicle. People go into the used market more often than not when you're anyone below the median income. And this seems to be like a way to try to leverage more people into spending more money on these certified used vehicles. So it's basically like the certified program says that there's nothing majorly wrong with these things. It gives a detailed accident history, or anything that was serviced on it will be part of that record. And it makes sense on one level, if you're trying to push used cars, but on the other hand, part of this whole service used car certified agreement is basically you have to keep going into the dealerships and their approved proxies for maintenance in order to keep that standard. If say you get into a fender bender, you have to go and get it fixed to the certain degree, or else you lose the certified status when you say try to resell it. So it's a way to, I guess, part out the excess capacity into uh, more of the secondary market to try to sell new parts to used vehicles.
Hmm.
Mm.
And on the one hand, well, you have, as you've both pointed out, more and more used car market people being pushed into by various reasons, and it's not helping the excess capacity problem. Like if the North America has 17 million cars sold in the last year and could produce 21 million, that's a huge amount of idle time of industry. So it's borrowing more and more from the future in order to keep the economy going, keep the companies moving.
And it's like I think like a reaction to that, and something that has like um been a response to that to like keep some like forms of revenue stream coming is just like these how like this auto loan sector also operates in like a very extractive way where you have these like a lot of these used vehicles in them, you know, like undergo like multiple like repossessions between owners and just like accrued debt onto them that get turned into these like collateralized debt obligations, right?
Hmm.
So it's like a lot of the loan bubble itself is also being fueled by, and like I guess like that entire apparatus is being sustained by this sort of like accumulation by dispossession, pushing up like money into like fictive capital and like these debts that they constantly accrue.
Yep. And unlike in the previous huge CDO bubble, which was in housing mortgages, car loans are a much shorter note, and so they also tend to have higher interest rates. And so, if someone doesn't pay their auto loan, you just hire some goons to go steal it back from them, and then
Oh,
throw it right back into circulation.
yeah, and the other crazy thing about this too is like so many of these are outfitted with like little tracking technologies that also beep when the person is behind on payments.
That is definitely morbid.
Yeah, and like imagine if someone constructed a technology like that to be able to like shut off the car if, you know, someone was like late on
If you
payments too.
defaulted on your life, if you defaulted on your debt.
Hmm.
Yeah. Default on the highway.
Coming to soon to a theater near you.
Like I mean, there's already that like app horror movie coming out about like the timeline on like people's like phones or something. So, not far off, I'm sure. I also think about like this auto industry crisis and how it's like volatile structure in place sustaining automotives in the US right now, and kind of how it could play in like how that's also going to be exacerbated by and like exacerbate into uh the fossil fuel sort of like scope. Like do you want to kind of talk about some of that, Bong?
Yeah. So, so there's a lot of pressures on fossil fuels right now. So the big issue with if you're like an oil company right now is that essentially your product is a cost that all the other bourgeois have to pay. So if you are, so one of the reasons oil companies have been historically very, very profitable compared to other companies has been that they in addition to being able to exploit their workers, can also kind of levy a tax on every other economic activity. We saw this really dramatically in the 1970s with the oil crisis, when OPEC basically said, we don't like your what you're doing politically, so we're gonna damage the whole U.S. economy or the whole world economy or whatever. As that, so there's this idea among oil producers and investors that people need oil, and because of this, businesses want to be using oil. When that isn't, economically speaking, that might be what it appears to be, but in the long term, that's not actually what's true. So, if you're a business, you have to pay basically for every transaction you make, sort of a surcharge that goes right to Shell or BP or Chevron or whatever. And if you as a company are able in some way to not pay that surcharge, you can conceivably open up a pretty sizable profitability window where you can start making money. And in an economy like this one with very low rates of profitability, I think we're going to start to see a lot of companies move away from oil over the next 10 years, or move away from gas over the next 10 years, just because it's so much more economical for them. I think a good example of this is Amazon recently pledged to beat their Paris Accords by decarbonizing by 2040 or whatever. But part of that was purchasing 100,000 electric delivery vans, and this is something that Amazon can do because they have so much economic power that they can basically invent a product and commission it, and then have it be produced in. It's really actually kind of incredible that they basically said, so there are no. They went into the market and said, there are no electrical delivery vans. We want 100,000 of them. So they basically invented a product, invented the demand for that product, and invented the entire the entire consumer base for that product. But you also see it in other stores, like retailers are putting solar panels on the roofs. Even in the Permian Basin, oil companies are actually using renewable energy to power their rigs and to power their systems. So that really goes to show just how much is out there to be gained by moving away from oil for these companies. And I think this is one of the ways that. Okay, so to circle it back around, the automobile market that exists today exists in a very close relationship with oil prices and with oil companies. But that's going to change, and I'm not quite sure what the dynamics of this are going to look like, because as you guys mentioned, it's a very, very weak market right now. People aren't going to be buying cars, and I have a hunch that due to the increased electronics and the increased mostly to the increased use of electronics in vehicles, as Alita pointed out on Twitter, that that these are not going to have the same turnover rates that older cars could have. Like a car built in the 60s can still theoretically run, but a car built in 2012 may be completely bricked because its computer no longer works. So I think there's going to be I think what's going to happen is there's going to be a shift over to electric vehicles, because to put it frankly, at the end of the next crisis, as I think Dick was saying to me the other day, or MDL was saying to me the other day, there's people are not going to be able to buy cars in 10 years. It's going to be like housing is after the 2008 crisis. You don't really, people used to have an expectation that you would buy a house. I think that's not going to be true in 2030. You're not going to be able to go out and buy a car. You might rent a car. You might share a car with some car mates. But you're not going to. The average person does not have the ability to go out and purchase a car. And in that kind of environment, electrical vehicles, which tend to run more expensive, are going to be very, very viable, just because there's no expectation of ever having to have a consumer that will buy that. And in addition to that, there's going to be a very rapid turnover in in the fleet. So you could see very, very rapid like declines in the amount of oil that's consumed, which would be murderous to the oil economy.
Yeah, if you look at like the current trend towards what all of the major automakers to, whether directly with a master plan or slowly through different parts, are moving towards cars that can act autonomously in driving situations. One of the ones I test drove recently had this really neat feature where not only could it uh, adjust the following distance when you had cruise control on, but it could also move you in the lane if it says, oh, you're getting out of the lane. So we're kind of creeping towards the self-driving car by baby steps. And when you have a car that can drive itself, why would you leave it parked at any point? You just literally have money sitting on the table. So you talked about moving towards sharing a car or renting a car. That clearly is the ultimate disruption that will be caused by self-driving cars. Is that these will be expensive products that will be have their costs shared among a large number of people. Go ahead, MDL.
Yeah, and like I think what's interesting about this too, though, is like where this technology is already like somewhat emergent is like the sort of like inner bourgeois like inside of the class sort of like split like political nature of these discussions, where it's like you have these like large shifts towards renewable systems and everything too, but like even in like the sort of like stage of the government, you're having sort of like there seems to be a bit of like a having your cake and eating it too approach to how to move towards like renewable energies and how to handle like this like decaying fossil that is like fossil fuels or whatever, but like um like there's still a lot being handed to those and a lot still like being invested or like reliant upon them, where I guess like my concern, we were talking about this last night, where it's like there's not going to be a possibility with things as structured like right now potentially to have this sort of like smooth transition. You'll have like a pretty severe disruption to it that would be the impetus to leading towards cars being like the not something that are like really within like the realm of like an attainable like ownership to people, like housing post 2008. Like it would be preceded by this sort of disruption in that market.
Yeah, and particularly from an American perspective, when you look out any urban hellscape in the United States, you see nothing but parking lots and all these uh, roads that are empty for most of the day, except for at 8 in the morning and 5 o'clock in the afternoon when they get choked full of people. There's this massive overproduction of infrastructure that, as cars decline, is going to inevitably be left to decay. I mean, we've already been seeing it in the United States with this common political thread that America's infrastructure is decaying, which is definitely true, but it's not as useful as it once was. Therefore, why would people invest public money into it?
You see, if we'd only listened to Howard Scott, we wouldn't have traffic, because we'd have implemented the technocratic day plan, and every shift would be staggered by 2 hours.
Perfect. Love it.
Technocracy was just Marxism, Leninism for mechanical. I mean,
go ahead.
Howard Scott was a research fellow with the IWW. He came from a left background.
Yeah, that's a thing that I think a lot of people forget about technocracy.
He definitely found a way to market the kind of mass technocratic things that were happening in the great experiment that was the Soviet Union to a bourgeois middle class market in the United States.
It's fascinating how like the technocracy movement had touched on the actual spirit of the age. I think the actual trends in the economy of the time more closely and with better, like, and more reasonably than any other movement, and yet they're one of the least well-known movements from that era.
Mhm. Well, I mean, it's hard to get more galaxy brain than their the North American TechNet, where everyone gets their goes up and has woken up at the precise right time to go to their job staggered out, and so everyone on the block will be staggered, having certain days off, and just have every aspect of your life planned down to the minutia, so you don't have to worry about anything.
This sounds like hell.
Oh yeah, and they also wanted to kill all the Hispanics. So
Oh,
I
that's
mean,
that's a nice little touch. Like,
yeah,
like you gotta
Mhm.
have your little kernel that makes it special, and that was theirs, I guess.
yeah. They were the OG. They wanted to invade Venezuela.
Really ahead of the curve on that one.
Yeah.
They initially got banned by the Canadian government, their Canadian branch did, for perceived subversiveness during World War II. And they
Oh
managed to
really?
get themselves unbanned by being the most hawkish proponents of total war to have ever exist. Like
Wow.
Who are
they
those?
the technocrats in
Oh yeah.
Canada, like,
Oh, in Canada.
because they had initially opposed the war
Mm.
on basic big brain engineering grounds, that this would be destructive of large amounts of physical infrastructure, and that is, generally a
That's the
bad
point
thing.
of war.
Yeah, I
Yep.
was about to say, like, and then they decided, wait, we actually need to clear out this massive fixed capital.
Yep. So yeah, they wanted to implement, part of their platform was total conscription, where basically have everyone be conscripted by the government to do whatever war related tasks the government saw that they needed. Whether it was digging ditches or going and dying in those ditches.
Isn't that what like Frederick Jameson kind of like talks about in like An American Utopia as well?
Yeah, I started that book a while ago, but I never finished it. It was definitely interesting.
Yeah, he basically talks about like dual power and like I guess like a universal army as like a way to like achieve communism, which like I don't necessarily hate. I mean, I like the idea of like universalizing the means of self-defense in a population.
It's interesting how ambitious everyone was, like through the 40s. Even the bad guys were very ambitious.
Yeah, that's something that I definitely think that has been lost, and something that we do need a little bit more of in our present. Like, right, wrong, or indifferent, there was this grand vision towards uh, the possibilities that could exist. And now the only people who talk in those terms right now are the, like, fucking Kurzweilian transhumanist wackos who think that if they take the right amount of vitamins every week, they'll live long enough to have their brain be put into a vat.
Hey, there's actually the other day, the other month, back in September, there was a pretty promising study done that said they could reduce people's age.
Yeah,
Did you read
I
that?
I saw that.
That sounds
There's
like
been
me living less long when I think about it.
So I actually read the article. Like the article that was published in the scientific journal. It was pretty interesting because most of this stuff is just absolute bullshit, you know. But what they were trying to do was like reinvigorate the immune system. They weren't even trying to make people younger. Like that just happened as an accident.
Mhm.
So I mean, I don't know. There's my
Yeah,
mortality bit I promised in the beginning.
Oh, there'll be more.
Absolutely. I mean, no, it's really interesting because like it's a collection of like well-known anti-aging processes being used to try to achieve something that and ending up like reducing epigenetic age. Like I don't know what that actually means because I'm not really a aging scientist, but it
yeah,
seems conservative enough for there to be like reason to merit it.
I definitely think it's possible to engineer people in such a way to actually deal with the fundamental causes of aging, but like oxidative stress upon your body, the shortening of telomeres. What I do find though more fascinating is how, and this goes back to how people's frontiers of possibility are so rapidly diminished in the past 50 years. Even the very idea of having people live longer, possibly be functionally immortal, is seen as this maximum heresy. You have people who,
Yeah, everyone would go like, "Oh, that would be horrible."
yeah, or like, the popular refrain of "Who wants to live forever?" Plugging
Mm-hmm.
the Queen song from the Highlander movie.
See,
When
I'm one of those people that finds living forever to be a horrifying idea.
Well, it
when
wouldn't
you think
be.
about it,
It wouldn't be.
it's living as long as you want to before you decide to end life on your own terms.
Well,
Yeah,
this
I
is
mean,
the
it's
thing
like, so like,
sorry.
if it works, what it means is, you live your normal life up until you're about 50, and then you go on this treatment, and you get to be, roughly age 30 for as long as you like. And that seems like a pretty great kind of thing.
That's like Logan's Run without the cutoff point.
Yeah, I think there's this kind of fundamental reproduction of our social relations that has to be enforced by not thinking that the world can get better, and part of that is like thinking, well, everyone dies.
Oh yeah,
and
agreed.
and so if you unsettle that sort of thing, then the suffering that people endure and the narrative that they construct for it, that this somehow gives their life meaning, breaks down, and then it becomes unbearable. In
Well, I guess
effect, people have Stockholm Syndrome for life itself.
Well, I guess like what interests me here too is like so like the linking of this more so to like thinking in terms of like the individual lifespan versus like possibility in the sense of a broader sort of like special like continuity, like
Mm-hmm.
in like a historic like a sense that like allows us to like historicize ourselves and like see that process also continuing, because like I don't know, I sometimes I think like the sort of transhumanist notion of like infinite life uh kind of hit some barriers too, and sort of like how they discuss these things too. Like, I mean, there's the one that is more ridiculous about like, like cloud uploaded consciousness and everything. And I think it just like fundamentally kind of ignores that like point where like I mean that's not like an organic consciousness being developed at that point, or like
Mm-hmm.
how does it sustain itself within that, like, and in the moment where this becomes separated like from like the bodily form, how is there not a real like constitutive death in that moment?
I the way I see, although I've always seen that working, is like it's a process. Like, so your consciousness is an emergent thing, and you have neuroplasticity. So essentially, the only way I could see it working is you would somehow link your brain to a neural network of some kind, and neuroplasticity would sort of allow your consciousness to inhabit that neural network. So you're thinking with the entire system, and as time goes on, you phase out bits of your brain, if that makes sense, by like manipulating that neuroplasticity. So
Yeah,
like if you had
that's the
a
way to make people feel better about the process, but fundamentally they are ship of thesising themselves.
Yeah,
yeah
that's a, like
yeah,
the
but
only
I
way
mean
it
we
could be
ship of Theseus
sustainable.
ourselves all the time.
Hmm.
Like
But
we're not. This
this
goes into a deep question, but go ahead.
this is a little bit more radical than merely the continued biological processes that replace cells in your body.
Okay, but I guess the fundamental question is like, what are we? Because I don't think we're the I don't think that the actual cells in the brain are what's important. I think it's we're like what emerges out of the sum of all those electrical impulses.
I would agree too, and I'd come from the perspective of someone who would definitely take a mind upload, but also would fully believe that this would mean the death of who I am now.
See, I would want to maintain that continuity of consciousness, because I just want to. I want to see everything. I want to know everything. You know, like that lady at the end of Indiana Jones 4.
See, I would gladly die.
Yeah.
I would gladly close the book.
Death cuck.
That's gonna be the internet sort of insult when this happens.
Yeah.
Yep. And I think one thing that always comes out very clear about futurists of every stripe are infamously bad about thinking about the social implications of the kinds of things that they are really, really into.
Yeah, because it's like for me it's like going back to that sort of like thinking in terms of like more of like our ability to like historicize ourselves and like do so and like a growing like potential to like really kind of like see this beyond just like distinctions between past, present, and future, you know, to like see the continuity of like humanity throughout those like periods. I also find to be like kind of like a fundamental sort of like consciousness to like communism, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that's also like what we're trying to build up in like movements as like we approach as well too, is that like this is a sort of like a class struggle that has been waged throughout time and, you know, extending it, you know, throughout different modes of like production and social organization. uh so like I wonder like if this sort of like ability to like kind of like maintain these consciousnesses throughout kind of like throws a bit of the wrench in the works there of it, because at the end of the day too we also have to kind of be like, because this is the thing too I think about with like how we think of revolution and like struggles and stuff too, where it's just like even like as we discuss like this, even as we discuss this like upcoming economic recession and potential capital crises that are latent within these like unprofitable sectors and bubbles and whatnot, it's not a final crisis for capitalism. There's not going to be a final crisis. The only way to actually destroy the capital relation is through like an active sort of like agent process and like series of confrontations and cycles that see this sort of like renunciation of like a faith of like a birth of a new mode of production out of the decay of the old one, because this relation can reproduce itself in new zones of accumulation at any point in time.
I think that was part of the appeal of the fully automated luxury communism meme.
Oh yeah, fuck that shit.
Yeah.
Well, I love the meme, but you know, fuck the book.
Yeah, definitely. The kind of talking point of like, well, if we just have this such massive automation, then communism will happen automatically and we won't have to actually struggle and fight and possibly die for it.
And that's what like I think is just so insane about all this stuff, is that like this notion that historical progress doesn't come without this sort of like real encounter, and it really is this sort of like repressing of like the sort of like traumatic real that we are exposed to within like these moments of class conflict that like continues to try to like push this confrontation under the surface, like this repression.
Mm-hmm.
And like you see it when these conflicts heat up and everything in like news, and you know you like you can kind of tell where you're like left punditries or your like social democrats start getting a bit chicken shit about, you know, people getting beat up in public, and it's just like, no, yeah, this is like how this starts to go down.
Yeah. One thing that I've been sort of wondering, as I know that like the modern left has very much sort of abandoned the idea of reformism entirely, and I think that that's
Not all of
broadly so.
They
Okay,
say they have.
the worthwhile sections of it have,
Hmm.
and what I think is interesting about this is we've seen a lot of like empirical evidence on whether or not reformism is possible. We've seen a lot of reformist groups not work, but what's interesting is that I haven't seen like a theoretical explanation that makes it that there's no theoretical point, as I understand it, where a process of reforming uh, capitalism into communism is impossible. And the reason I bring this up is not because I think we should be reformists, but because I think it's a possible like it would be a possible transition form, other than as we saw in like the United Kingdom, or as we saw in like the revolutions from feudalism to capitalism that took place in some places over a long period of time, without without very much or with relatively minimal, um, what I guess you
Minimal
could say.
direct
Yeah,
internecine warfare between classes.
yeah, like in
Well,
the UK where they still have all the trappings of feudalism, around a very completely capitalist bourgeois democratic system, and it makes me think like wonder if like if if there could be a some kind of system that would arise where for whatever reason moving resources into the commons produces profit for a significant fraction of the bourgeois. I think that's what would be required. I don't even know if that's possible.
well, I don't think you could do that without reaffirming sort of like the like foundational like power of the bourgeois' existence.
How so?
Well, like what we're kind of like not, I guess, like what would have to be addressed here really concretely in sort of like any sort of like idea that we can kind of like come from within this like
Hmm.
current organization of society and mode of production like closer towards that communistic one. Like we're kind of approaching the sort of like dangest approach to how to get to communism, right? Like
Well, well,
like
what I'm proposing is not like a policy that communists should support, but rather a like an idea of what could ultimately become an organic, so ultimately could be the organic social process that results in communism. As we saw, for example, in in the UK, the forces that wanted a republic and wanted a bourgeois democratic state explicitly wanted a republic and a bourgeois democratic state.
well, and they had to get that through like sort of like through revolutionary sort of like movements and
Hmm.
actions that occurred. That
Yeah.
But I
same thing with
think
the French Revolution, right?
the,
Like
the major difference, though, in this case is that you had the transition from one form of class society to another.
Ah,
The transition
no,
to
that makes
communism
sense.
is the transition to a class society.
yeah,
In
see,
in the United Kingdom, you had effectively the marriage between the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy in literal as well as symbolic terms,
yeah,
where
I think that's what I
people.
was trying to get at too with like where your limit would be that like there's still a reaffirmation of class distinction.
Mhm. You
Yeah.
had successful capitalists marrying their children off to major titled landlords
Hmm.
and kind of uniting both of their interests through the inheritance of property. And
And that and that's like the flaw that you see with the people that kind of like defend the sort of like Chinese socialism by 2050 thing, right? Is that
Yeah.
they're ignoring the fundamental sort of like class division that their processes of capital accumulation over the past few decades have been reliant on, because you don't
Yeah.
have capital and accumulation, like you don't have that profit without that fundamental like base of separation, which like primitive accumulation was the originator of.
Although I have to point out, just imagine how legendary it would be if they did do it. Like they're like
Oh,
January 1st, 2050. Here we go.
that'd be so fucking insane. I
That's impossible.
you
I
know,
would I would
It's
have
like,
to
you
do
know,
like
that part of you that wants to believe in the Posadist thesis that there are communist aliens out there waiting to save us
Yeah.
from ourselves.
Are you
Yeah.
saying there's not?
I'm just saying I want to believe.
Bro, who's been spooking the U.S. Air Force?
Oh, Tom DeLonge, apparently.
Yeah. What a legendary grift that is.
So yeah, I think, and this is something that we constantly get into fights with the Dengists and anyone who they call themselves the anti-revisionists, but they still end up
Or
getting into this.
revisionist.
Well,
Well, like it's a
I mean,
revision in
both the
that.
Dengists and the more orthodox Maoists and Marxist Leninists still fundamentally believe in this class collaborationist strategy. They believe that
But
you can, if they call it not a capitalist class, then they can have this class collaborationist nonsense where we can develop the nation state's capital, develop productive forces, is as if the world isn't already overdeveloped in productive forces compared to what people actually need. Like we're seeing people put fucking gold leaf onto food and eating it. There's clearly a mismatch of where productive forces are being allocated.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I think this is like the fundamental sort of like flaw of like the social democrat like reform strategy and like reform strategies you see within the is that you have this sort of like it is a class collaborationism, right? Like if you're working within like a state that is still fundamentally a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, you're going to have that sort of collaboration, and it effectively neutralizes possibilities for revolution. And I think this is what's like really important about Marxism and this sort of like approach to history is that you see that like these conflicts, like again, that sort of encounter with the traumatic real are actually vital to the like advancement or like increased democratization of society and its trajectory towards classlessness, or it's like the assertion of like the increasingly universalizing proletariat towards like the realization of its self-abolition is you have to like directly encounter the forces that are maintaining the class separation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's
This is.
why
Oh, go ahead.
fundamentally, I think one of the most important things that I've learned just looking through the history of the 20th century and from reading people like Amadeo Bordiga is that when the proletariat seizes power, it cannot share power with anyone. No one outside of the proletariat can share in the process.
And like the implication of that being that if the proletariat has that power, then you like effectively are sort of like neutralizing the existence of a bourgeoisie, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's what I
Well,
think that's interesting about the dictatorship of the proletariat idea is like because like functionally if you have a dictatorship of the proletariat, like by definition of that, like in the distinction between like what proletariat versus like bourgeoisie is, like you would not ideally like have a bourgeoisie.
Yep, and that's basically the whole international process of the revolution is that there's going to be places where revolution sparks off first, more intense conflict points. And so that's why it's an internationalized struggle.
and I mean,
And if you have the dictatorship of the proletariat making any sort of concessions to international capital, that is effectively the end of the revolution.
one thing that's interesting about that is that like the bourgeois existence is like a very much a juridical relationship. It's an existence founded on the laws that exist,
Mm-hmm.
and and since World War II, that's been very much sort of emblazoned in as in international law, like the international right to property, and that's something that like will set the proletariat on a direct collision course with these sort of center left social democratic systems, because they're fundamentally incompatible with proletarian power.
Yes. And
But that's like it's like an international thing. That all the nations of the world, there's no longer, I mean, in 1917, the Soviets could play at being independent from other bourgeois powers because they were whatever diplomatically oppositional or isolated or didn't have recognition or whatever. But I mean, but with the foundation of the United Nations, sort of everything, all of that. I mean, it's no longer possible to pretend like that.
Yeah, because like they encounter at their frontiers there's still like formal subsumption within like a globalizing like capitalist mode of production and like trade market.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that
Oh,
I
sorry.
was
Go ahead.
rereading, it was Proletarian Dictatorship and Class Party by Bordiga, and he talked about something very interesting. He said one of the things that's said about the bourgeois national revolutions is the obsession with treachery within the revolution. The idea that these aristocrats were somehow traitors to the nation that they had never pledged loyalty to, and he said that in the dictatorship of the proletariat, there would not be any need or any desire to have this sort of fictitious pageantry of, well, the bourgeoisie are traitors to our nation, when they're point in fact are not. He called them prisoners of the social war, that effectively people whose existence had been predicated on all these judicial privileges given to them by the bourgeois state, by being declassed in the process of revolution, effectively become prisoners of war.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think there's space for like hostis humanus generis, which is enemy of humanity in general.
I would definitely agree.
That was applied to like pirates and slavers, but I think there's definitely some sections of the bourgeois which are, hostis humanus and generis, oil bourgeois,
Yeah, the
arms
oil
dealers.
barons, arms dealers.
I mean that's like half of the bourgeois these days, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so much of them get tied up into that.
Drug company CEOs.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, they're head of the list.
Yeah, and I guess this is kind of like diverging from this part, but like thinking of this like internationalism too, and like revolution as an international process, we really do have to like look at these like this global wave of revolt that is really hitting right now, like that's been kicked off in like your peripheral regions of the globe, and just like been rapidly accelerating over the past like 2 years. um it's this like phenomenon where like we've talked about it before, where the action of the class itself is like far outpacing any capacity that any sort of semblance of an organized left has to really like comprehend or respond to it. And like that like really feels like prescient too, and thinking of sort of just like the, I don't know, it's like the necessity, or like when we talk about like revolution as necessity, it's not like a thing we got to get over and do and just like get it over with, rip the band-aid off. No, it's like it's a necessity because it like necessarily happens this way. Like
I
within the
forget
class
who.
relation, it just comes to this conflict.
Yeah, there's this term commonly applied to Napoleon Bonaparte's history on horseback, where the events of the French revolutions and the Napoleonic Wars were developing so fast, far beyond any one person's ability to master it. Where even Napoleon Bonaparte, the emperor, of this whole process is largely just the man running fast enough to keep at the head of these mass social movements. And I think we're starting to see trends towards that again.
And I think we should generally expect like the Communist Party to be sort of pushed ahead of by like the more advanced sections of the proletariat, just because I mean the Communist Party is composed of those sections of the proletariat which are I guess proletariat and intelligentsia, but ideally mostly proletariat, who are, you know, interested in the long term concept of revolution. But I mean, by the fact that the Communist Party is like a political party or a political organization and not like an active war fighting unit,
Mm-hmm.
like they're not necessarily the first people who are going to be pushed into a position of militancy, because people are already being pushed into positions of militancy uh, all over the world. And I mean, you know, I would say those groups are definitely in some ways at least more advanced than
I
basically any
I
communist
think
organization.
definitely one thing I would definitely feel safe making as a prophecy is that the whatever revolution takes place next, the actual direct assault on capital that openly claims itself to be communist, will not be helmed by any already existing communist or socialist party. It'll be something made for its own time. Any existing organization, if you are a part of them right now and think that you can shape them into being something revolutionary, I think you're deluding yourselves.
Oh yeah, like I think about this with like the idea of like party composition a lot, where it's if like the organizational form is attempting to prefigure the actual like organized action of the class itself, then it's false. Like
Hmm.
the party, like historically, if we're like thinking of like what the Communist Party is the constituted actions of the class
Yep.
in its historical movement. Like like isn't there like some anecdote or something about like where like Communist Party, like I mean it didn't come from Marx and Engels themselves. They used it because it was the name of that the like workers that were organizing near them were using.
Hmm.
It like, and in this sense too, it's like I could say like the actions that are happening on a global scale right now, I think constitute like a stage of party formation, and potentially like the sort of like when they if it coheres into an organizational form for whatever purpose, like that process of constitution becomes like a formalization that suits a
You cut out
particular
there.
need of the time.
Yep.
So it's like I think like all these like party organizations that exist right now are just like they it's a lot of clowny kind of stuff, really, to
Yep.
be
To draw
it
from a real
yes.
historical example, I think the last thing you could say that organization in the United States that was constitutive of any like vanguard or communist position was the Black Panther Party in the 1960s and 70s.
Yeah, and that because that arose out of like a real like sort of like formational need and like a organically growing militancy out of the community.
Hmm. And its programs, whether it's the Klan watches, protecting against police brutality, or the community breakfast programs, were arose from real needs within their constituents.
Hmm.
And like that's where you're going to see like that's like what real party formation is nowadays, like not
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of the sort of like existing quote unquote parties all sort of like vying for online visibility right now, or like visibility at protests and stuff, are sort of like symptoms of a like buying into like the sort of like bourgeois conception of political parties, like as like you know functional political units within an existing political reality. And like the Communist Party project and like the organization of like the proletariat into its own like party that can represent its own interests will necessarily have to be a sort of like break and reconfiguration of the situation from like a dominant ideology that mystifies the like concrete relations of that society.
And well, yeah, the Communist Party can take certain juridical forms within bourgeois society. These are things that are done opportunistically rather than standing for elections because this is the way of things.
Yeah, they will be like pragmatic constitutions that occur for whatever reasons they need to.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question, which is about that standing for election business, which is, what do you guys think of like sort of like this, the AOC, and I've seen some other guys on Twitter who are like generally like working class people who end up deciding to run for office. Like, do you think that that's uh do you think that those people possess like real progressive potential, or do you think they're just sort of
I think
ultimately going to become careerists and opportunists?
in the initial stages they definitely have potential, but the question is always like, you take a worker out of the working class environment, they're going to cease to be a worker. The question is, how long does that take?
Mm.
Yeah, and I think it also has to do more with sort of like subsumption into a sort of like formal role that they don't control as an individual within it. That seems like important to think about, because like when you see those like candidates and sort of like the gains that seem to be most worth paying attention to really are like mobilizations of people behind them.
Yeah, the apparatus that they create is more important than the candidacy themselves.
It's the same thing with like like Bernie Sanders stuff. Like if you're actually looking at Bernie Sanders and like trying to glean out what he says from things and get him into the office and let him just like do the job as the end goal, like that's missing the whole point. The interesting thing that's happening there is the sort of like mass mobilization coming from like a lot of people like most adversely experiencing the effects of like neoliberal austerity, like taking political responses to their situation and the potential ways in which like their affiliation with or engagement with that campaign can increase politicization.
Yeah, I always think of the British Prime Minister Harold Wilson, who said something like, "I'm trying to run a Bolshevik revolution with a cabinet full of Tsarists." And so Harold Wilson was kind of like the golden boy of the labor left, as I understand it, and it was a while ago. But he had a track record of supporting the unions and supporting LGBT rights, and a whole bunch of blah blah blah. But when the time came when the rubber hit the road, he was more his office, and he was ultimately, as I recall, I'm not super well versed on British politics, but as I understand it, he was a fairly disappointing prime minister,
Oh yeah,
all things considered.
one of the most scandal racked premierships in British politics.
Yeah, so it was not the thing that he was, that however, whatever Harold Wilson really thought about, however much of a Bolshevik Harold Wilson really was, which probably not that much of a Bolshevik. Uh, like he couldn't survive the realities of public office, and I think that's true for these guys too.
You saw a very similar thing, Mitterrand's presidency in France in the 1980s.
Oh yes,
where he's able to win a major mandate at first, but the realities of capital flight cause such a malaise to fall upon the country that within a few
yeah,
years, he's forced to cohabit with the right wing parties who control the parliament now.
yeah. From gun-toting communist guerrilla. Wait, no, he was Vichyist, right?
Um,
He worked for Vichy, and then he became
yeah,
a
yeah.
rebel.
I'm not super well versed into Francois Mitterrand's history. All I know is that he came from a major political family that was connected with the center right in France, and he was sort of the black sheep of the party because he joined the Parti Socialiste.
Yeah, although it was a little more complicated back then. Like, as I remember, like pre-war French politics were uh, incredibly French, I will say.
You had
Like, you
this
had like Group
thing,
Exclus, the
yeah.
neo-socialists. You had this whole
There's this
collection.
phenomena political scientists call sinistrisme in French politics, where in the Third Republic in particular, so much of things that were traditionally considered as conservative were so passe and distrusted among the French electorate that you had an ever ratcheting placement of parties that had once been considered left becoming the new conservatives.
Yeah, like the Radical Party.
Yep, the radical socialist and Republican left was the center right party in France, because the actual terms of like conservative and such were so associated with monarchism that to be a Republican in French context required you to adopt the monikers of the left.
Yeah, and so and what's interesting is that they weren't is that it was all like kind of skin deep. Is that a lot of these groups
Yes,
ultimately were,
like
deeply
so,
deeply conservative or reactionary.
yeah, so many of the moderate socialists end up becoming people who collaborated in the Vichy regime.
Yeah. I mean, basically, the only it's wild how the Fourth Republic was like, uh, was all it was the if the Third Republic was all like people calling themselves socialists, the Fourth Republic was like all the monarchists coming out of the woodwork, and,
Hmm.
and it's actually this is one of those things where it's a sort of an alternate history cliche to restore monarchy somewhere, but it's honestly kind of surprising that there wasn't some kind of French monarchy in the cards.
I think ultimately, had there been, just one viable claimancy line, maybe that would have happened. But the big problem is that France has a surplus of claimants to the throne.
Tendency of the rate of monarchical legitimacy to fall.
Yeah. I mean, you got to choose whether it's House Orleans or House Bourbon or House Bonaparte.
Yeah, and those all have horrible political implications too.
Mm-hmm.
What I read is that this is in Julian Jackson's France: The Dark Years. Is that uh, basically no after the establishment of the Pétain regime, like there was a period of like almost a year when when even like the Free French didn't really consider themselves to be like fighting for the French Republic. Like the idea that you would support like liberty, equality, fraternity was so like after the economic malaise, the social disaster, and finally the military collapse of the Third Republic. The idea that you would be like, yeah, we should have another French Republic was so ridiculous that even the Free French wouldn't. Like it was like politically toxic for them as well.
Yep. And like went into all of the absurd triangulation that happened among the allies, where so many figures that were connected with the Vichy regime were considered more trustworthy and favorable by American and British military leadership to try to lead a French fifth column against Germany than the actual Free French forces themselves.
Yeah, I mean, like the U.S. printed occupation script for France.
Hmm.
Uh, they were prepared to set up
Yep,
a
and a
French.
military government in France
Yeah,
to rule them as an occupied territory, which, given the scale of Vichy involvement in the war effort and in the Holocaust, may have actually been a more beneficial solution in the long run.
yeah. I mean, there's a very big blind spot in the French government about the the reality of Vichy.
Hmm.
There's this idea that France left France and went to fight with de Gaulle, but I mean the Gaullist forces were primarily colonial troops.
Yep.
Um,
and the French resistance itself, like that really only grew explosively towards the last year before liberation too.
Yeah, and a
For most,
lot of the French resistance was just people who were like very poor or otherwise, uh, like bandits, basically, like people who had been made illegal by the German government. And so those became the actual armed core of the resistance. So they were
yeah,
kind of pushed into it. It wasn't like,
this is basically how materialists understand how revolution happens. It's
yeah,
not brave people fighting for liberty, equality, fraternity. Those slogans do come into it, but the slogans always change, but the reality remains the same. People being pushed into resisting the systems of oppression that they are put into.
mm, yeah. I mean, so next week we want to talk about like World War II, and we're probably going to talk more about France next week
Mm-hmm.
and the sort of the aftermath of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, World War II is definitely one of those shattering epoch moments that
Yeah,
I think it's really hard to, even 70 years later, really piece together like all of the moving parts and how so much changed in it.
yeah.
Just like,
In an instant, it was 5 years. Like imagine if 5 years ago, like all the countries that existed 5 years ago just didn't exist. You know,
mm-hmm.
um, I mean
I
that's the old days when wars were counted in years and not decades.
yep. So yeah, that'll definitely be very interesting. I think the one thing World War II definitely has is that it has all of the seductive quality of a good example that tends to poison everything afterwards by comparison to
Mm.
it. All of
Yeah,
this, all of the strategies that went into it, the particularly say for example on the communist left, the Soviet defensism, Popular Front strategies, which brought communists into the political mainstream and ended up destroying their revolutionary potential.
yeah. I mean,
That's
there was a time there where all of the great bourgeois powers were like, "We love the hammer and sickle. Go get
Mhm.
'em, Uncle Joe." Uh, it's fascinating how pro-communist like the United States was during World War II. Like the
Mhm.
U.S. worked with Mao and Ho Chi Minh and obviously Stalin
Yep.
very extensively.
And one thing I would like to get into next week that is often forgotten is like there was this repressed social revolution that went on in the wherever the war happened. Like in the amidst the advance of Allied armies, you had this sort of mass disintegration of the German or Italian states, where like workers seized control of their factories, they stopped showing up to work, the whole social system decomposed, and then you had this awful sort of example where the Soviet Union, under Stalin's orders, told these workers to go back to work and hand over ownership back to the people who legally owned these factories.
Yeah, I mean, it was it was the hope and the tragedy. You know, an era of tremendous horror, but now has become sort of an era of tremendous romance.
Yep, that'll be a good title for it. The Hope and the Tragedy.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll see you guys next week. And actually, uh, yeah, we'll see you guys next week. And stay tuned for our November 9th episode as we
It's
talk
coming.
about the reason why we named this podcast such an unpronounceable word.
Valery Sablin did nothing wrong.
Absolutely, very, very literally true. All right, I'm gonna
Open the pod bay doors, Craig.